when I do EQ, I'm looking for two things. The first thing is I'm looking for to take away um, some of the bad things. And usually with most instruments, it's in this mid range. The reason being is that almost every instrument, with the exception of the bass, your guitars, snare drum, string instruments, horns, vocals, they all have information within this mid range. And so I'm usually in here looking for some problem spots, and I'm going to slightly decrease some of those frequencies. And you do that by sweeping the EQ. So the first thing we're going to do here, let's go ahead and let's sweep this guitar right here and find out if there's any problem spots that we want to take out. So let's listen. So that's our affected track. Now, to find the problem spots, what we're going to do is this particular EQ, the Q or the quality goes from 0 all the way up to 10. The default is 1. Now what the Q does is, let's say I had this cranked up like this, the Q, and you can see we are now boosting from, I don't know, around 80 hertz in different variations to around, looks like about 600 or 700 hertz. Most of that being at 200 hertz. So it kind of slopes down and slopes down that way. You can, if you don't want, say, the 100 hertz affected, or you want to kind of, you might not want to boost all of this, you can narrow your Q. Now, so we're going to go in, let's find some problems. And I'm going to use a very narrow Q. Sometimes I go all the way up to 10. Well, let's just go to 8 for now. And I am going to hold down the mouse button on this little dot here. And I am going to affect that. So you can also do that from down here. And you can sweep the frequency left and right that way. Or you can use your mouse. And typically, I like to use my mouse. So I'm going to boost that real loud. I don't think I've ever, used a 14 dB increase of EQ. We'll talk about, how much to increase your EQ in a minute. But right now, we want to boost that so any problem spots really stand out. So let's give this a listen. We're going to sweep back and forth. Ah. You saw how that at 346 hertz, you saw how that note rang out, and we even got a bunch of clipping up in here because we had it turned so high. So that's a spot where there's so much information in this instrument that we can decrease it a little bit. And by decreasing a little bit, notice it's at 346 hertz. Like I said before, most instruments have lots of information, especially in the 200 to 400 hertz range. So this one has so much information at 346 hertz that we can decrease it a little bit. It'll make the instrument sound a little bit better. It'll make the instrument sit in the mix, and it'll also keep all of these mid frequencies from piling on each other and making the overall mix sound muddy. So if you take a little bit where there's a lot of information from different instruments, you can carve out a notch for each instrument, and they won't be competing with each other and piling these mid frequencies, and your mixes will sound clearer. So what we're going to do is, usually I start at about -2 is usually sufficient, and I'm going to expand this out a great deal. Now, why did I choose 1.4? In this, when the Q goes up to 10, and with this particular EQ, a Q of 1.4 will cover a full octave of the instrument. And most of the time, except like with a guitar solo or some solo or something, most of the time, instruments are operating within 1 octave. So you're pretty safe in 1.4. But typically, I want to leave more information in. So the key here is to listen. So now we'll hear what this sounds like. So this amount of EQ didn't affect that guitar a whole lot, which is what we want. We don't want to we're not doing shaping here. We're just pulling out a little bit of that problem area so it doesn't ring out, and also to leave room for the other instruments in a mix. Now, you might want to reshape an instrument. You might have a note that's really bad. And typically for a really bad note, I'll get down, to 3, 3.5, 4, somewhere up in there. And when I'm dipping down this low, once again, you have to listen. Typically, I'll double that so that it affects the EQ at half of an octave range, so that you're not making the instrument too thin by pulling so many of its frequencies out, because frequencies equals volume and it equals fullness, and if you start pulling those out, your instrument can end up sounding too thin. Usually 2, 2.5, 1.5 is usually sufficient to clean up an instrument, and this is most prevalent around a whole mix. So once you find that problem area and pull it out, you're going to want to come back in and listen to it in the whole mix to make sure that you didn't take too much. You might need to pull a little more out. You might need to pull a little bit more out. But once you get it in the whole mix, it'll start to show the effect that it really had. So we pulled out a little bit here.